Pavlo, you're breaking up again.
Пані Оксано, давайте вмикайте. Friends, great pleasure and great honor to announce yet another lecture from the series lecture series being delivered by our esteemed and dear friend and colleague, Dr. Greenfield, for those who are not affiliated with our Department of Sociology at Kyiv Polytechnic Institute, research and writing careers. His writing prolifically. He's a prolific writer on issues of military conflicts and wars. He has authored more than almost a dozen of books. He's also covering extensively dynamics of higher education in North America. And today's lecture will be devoted to the intellectual legacy of famous yet little
I can't hear anything you're saying, Pavlo.
Outside of the United States, African-American sociologist, Dubois, right, and Nathan.
Okay. Okay, I assume you've stopped, Pavlo, because I see your lips not moving, but I can't hear you. So raise your hand if I should go ahead.
Really sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Шановні друзі, мене чутно було?
Ні, дуже погано з переривами.
Okay.
Одну секунду. Шановні друзі, мене чутно?
I'll get going. Is that okay? Raise your hand, Pavlo, if that's okay.
We'll restart if you don't mind, okay?
Oh, okay. Okay, so thank you very much for again
Пані
having
Оксано,
me
давайте
again
зупинимо.
From what is in fact a very cloud Ukraine. I'll be talking about Ukraine and Dubois and double consciousness. But the Ukraine part comes at the second part of the lecture. Okay, a quick timeline. William Edward Burghardt Dubois, as I said, rhymes with voice, was born in 1868 in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, which is the western part of the state, not very far from the New York State border. He was born to a family of free blacks. In fact, they had been free for several generations. And the family owned land and was, in fact, had what was, in terms of the blacks in the United States in the 1860s, would have been in the upper probably 10% financial income. Obviously, the vast majority in the 1865 were slaves in the South. The family, this is his background. His mother is Dutch English. Her African ancestors, great-great-grandfather, a slave, was kidnapped in 1730 in West Africa. And his father was from Poughkeepsie, New York, which is about 100 miles north of New York City. He comes from French Huguenot background, or Huguenot, as sometimes pronounced, background, which is where you get the Du Bois from. Mixed race, although Alexander Du Bois, through Alexander Du Bois, 1830s. Alexander Du Bois raped a black woman, and she had a child, and that's where the Du Bois names comes from. He grew up in a mixed race, though importantly, most blacks were mixed race. Now, this comes in, there's I'm using the term here differently, two different ways at the same time. The community of Great Barrington had both blacks and whites living in it. So that was a mixed race community. And most people who were black were also mixed race. That is to say, they were mulattoes, octroons, and we'll get to that. And you see that with the family, with the background of Dubois himself, that he was of mixed race. Although in the United States, that only matters, at the time, that only mattered to a very small degree in certain places. He went to local schools and then went to Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. It was between 1885 and 88. It was one of the first HBCUs, what are now called HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, founded in 1866 after the Civil War to educate the freedmen in Tennessee. He was an extraordinarily bright student, which is why he was able to get into Fisk in the first place. And when he graduated, he immediately went to Harvard between 1888 and 90, and was influenced by William James. He, author of Varieties of Religious Experience and Pragmatism, John Dewey. Basically, for those of you who don't know what pragmatism is, it's the view that the purpose of philosophy and thought is to create tools for prediction and problem solving and social action rather than describing or representing or mirroring reality. So, for example, you don't have Dewey's writings, although they were as impenetrable at times as Hegel's or Kant's, even though he wrote in English, his emphasis is not on trying to figure out how we know what we know. It's more, if I want to put it in a nutshell, how can we act with what we know and what we have? In 1891, Dubois received a graduate degree from Harvard in sociology. Now, we're going to stop here and we're going to move back a bit to talk about race. And this is calling this racial thinking. Okay, so where does racial thinking come from? That is to say, where does the view that blacks, black Africans, black Americans, blacks in general are lesser than whites? Well, there are a number of places it comes from. The first is the Bible. And that is the story of Ham, who is one of Noah's sons, the one who saw his father's nakedness, who is cursed by Noah, and you shall be the servants of Cain, it says in the Bible. And that is one of that little line in Genesis is one of the foundations of Western racism. It was used in the Middle Ages. It was used in the Renaissance, it was used in the Enlightenment, and it was used on the floor of the United States Congress in the 1860s to defend slavery. The slave trade, now slave trade is an interesting thing. Obviously, it begins after the discovery, quotation marks, of America in 1492, and then the settlement that follows by the Portuguese and the Spanish. A settlement, of course, means the military imposition of their rule on what became Mexico and South America and Latin America. The Portuguese started the slave trade. So, and that's important. So the Portuguese slave trade to Brazil, what is now Brazil, was 5.8 million slaves. Britain to the Caribbean islands mainly and the U.S. colonies transported 3.2 million. The French to the Sugar Islands and Haiti, 1.3 million. Spain, 1 million, Dutch, 5 million, 0.5 million, sorry. Now, the vast majority of the slaves that landed in America, approximately 2/3 died on the Middle Passage. But that is to say, they died en route because of the conditions of the slave ships. The death rates were close to 100% on the Sugar Islands, in Brazil, in what is now Suriname, because of the kind of labor that was there and the diseases that were endemic. So one of the reasons why these numbers are so high, 5.8, 1.3, which is 1 million more than what it became the United States, is because a slave population did not reproduce itself. It had to be replaced by the slavers and the colonizers. That was not the case in the United States, which is not to soft pedal the horror of whippings, brutal beatings, cutting off of ears, cutting off of thumbs, rapes, hangings. It's not to soft pedal that at all, but it is important to note in the history of slavery that the slave population in the United States, what became the U.S., by 1776, it was 490,000. So 1820, 1.7 million. In 1860, 4.4 million. So in that 40 years after the slave trade was closed, that is to say the slave trade from Africa, slaves could be traded inside the United States, more than doubled. And that's an important point in the difference between slavery in the United States, what became the United States, and slavery elsewhere on the continent. By 1900, there were 8.8 million blacks. Of course, I shifted terminology from slave to black after 1865, or 11% of the population, which is approximately what it is today. I think it's about 13.1 today. Stop me at any point if you have a question. Any questions here?
Not yet.
Okay.
Everything's clear.
Okay. Timeline 3. Important to do this now because Dubois goes to Germany, studies at Friedrich Wilhelm University with Max Weber, just at the time where Weber is formulating his Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, which is published a few years later. He returns to the United States, goes to Harvard, and becomes the first black person to get a PhD from Harvard. Now, I did this racial thinking and then Du Bois because I wanted to give you an idea of the world in which he came out of in terms of the thinking about what blacks were. Now, we'll go deeper into that now. I said before that he was mixed race. Now, I don't know, this is I maybe can make this a little bit larger. Yeah, I can. This is the one-drop rule, which the Nazis, by the way, copied word for word from the statutes of the state of Oklahoma when talking about Jews. The one-drop rule was a legal statute in a number of southern states where if you had one drop of quote-unquote black blood, that made you a black and hence subject to slavery. Now, there's a kind of irony in this because, of course, everything else that the racial thinkers were writing about showed that whites were superior. But obviously, they didn't take that into the irony they didn't catch when they're saying that one drop of black blood, which, of course, is an impossibility because you can't have just one drop. But let's put that aside for a moment and think in terms of, you know, these phantasmagorical racial structures of the United States. So a black and a black marrying, you have a mulatto. If two mulattoes, so that then you go down the next, you have a quadroon. You go down the next, octroon. Down the next, a mustee. And you can see where the mating takes place with those lines. I couldn't put it on this because I couldn't find a really good one, and also I'd have to have used 3 screens. American law went to 16 levels. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So let's assume 15. 3 times this chart. The Nazis used it completely without changing a single comma after translation, of course. In determining who was a Jew. In fact, the Nazis cut off at a certain point. Some states went further than the Nazis did. So, you know, this is grandparents. Well, okay, you can do it this way. Grandparents, okay. You, parent, grandparent, great-grandparent, great-great-grandparent, great-great-great-great-grandparent, great-great-great-great-great-grandparent. Okay, we have to look for a moment at what great thinkers said, those we view as great thinkers said about blacks. And I have to reduce this screen. How do I do that? That did not reduce it. That took up my whole screen. Okay. I cannot see the words on the far right. How do I do that? All right, okay, you read it and fill in the words on the right. According to Hegel, Africans retain a pure inwardness that never proceeds to development. The Africans are now as they have been, or I guess it's have been, thousands of years ago. They have never gone out of themselves, but always remain within themselves in a it's childishness or childlike. Just click it. Yeah, I see the tiles. That's good. Oh, I can see it. Okay, that's better. Always remain within themselves in a childlike manner. They have remained in the condition of particularity, of individuality, of desire, and have not developed the oppositions of understandings of law and particular instances. Basically, what he's writing here is they're savages. Childlike savages. I can show you more. Hegel. On natural characteristics, Hegel wrote that, I can't see that word, Africans have by nature no feeling that rises above trifling. Trifling means a small thought. Can't believe the black people were so talkative that they must be driven apart from each other with thrashings. I defy you to find in Kant, the great exponent of the categorical imperative, Kant, the great foundation of humanist thinking, I defy you to find in Kant another example where he says people should be whipped. Indeed, for Kant, black people were said to have thick skin and thereby should be disciplined, not with sticks, but rather whipped with split canes. Again, I defy you to find that in Kant, where he says another people, their skin is thick and we can hurt them more by using this. This is the world that Dubois, having left the racist United States, enters into in the Enlightenment thought of Friedrich Wilhelm University, or Universität, I guess I should say. David Hume, I am apt to suspect that the Negro, I still can't see everything, that, oops, that counts. Hume. I am apt to suspect that the Negroes, again, I can't see those words, but I know what they are inferior to whites. They scarcely ever was a... Pavlo, can you read that for me? Can somebody read it out?
Oh, yeah, I can, sorry. I was muted. Can you hear me? Okay. David Hume, philosopher of Scottish Enlightenment. I'm apt to suspect that Negroes to be naturally inferior to the whites. There scarcely ever was a civilized nation of that complexion, nor even individual eminent in action or speculation.
Okay,
though he was against
slavery. I can read the rest.
Slavery.
Yeah, I'm fine with the rest. Thank you very much, Pavlo. So, yeah, David Hume was against slavery, but this is what he wrote about Negroes, about blacks. And then we get to Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, author of, well, you know what, but we'll get to it in a minute, owned slaves. He did not manumit, that is to say, free his slaves, even though he was against the slave trade, as we'll see in a moment. He had an ongoing relationship, which we can call decades of rape, with Sally Hemings, who was a slave of his wife and probably her half-sister. Genetic testing has shown that Thomas Jefferson's descendants, Sally Hemings' descendants, are cousins to those Jeffersons that we know as the straight line, which proves that Thomas Jefferson and or his brother, likely also, raped the Hemings women, the Hemings family women. She accompanied him to Paris when he was the American delegate to Paris, and for some reason didn't claim her freedom. It may have been because her children were still slaves of Jefferson back in Virginia. We don't know the reason. But of the founding fathers, Washington owned slaves. He did free them in his will. Jefferson sold slaves because of his debts. But Washington, only very early in his life, sold a slave. Madison, the author of half of the Federalist Papers, owned slaves. Monroe owned slaves. The only founding fathers of the major founding fathers who didn't own slaves were John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. Adams from Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin from Pennsylvania, well, Massachusetts originally, but most of his life, Pennsylvania. And he founded the first anti-slave organization in the United States. Now, this is very important for understanding the world that a person like Dubois emerges from. This document you must recognize. It is, does anybody know what it is? Pavlo, you're not allowed to answer. Does anybody know what it is?
I am not answering, but it says what it is
Yes,
on
it
the
does.
top.
Yeah. It is the Declaration of Independence. It's of the United States, July 4th, 1776. And it's one of the originals, not the one that's in Trump's office now, but one of the originals. And this is the printing of it. So it's a little bit easy to read. Not much, but a little bit easier. This section here is what I want to look at. And I will read it to you. Those are the charges, basically, for the prosecution against King George. So he has quartered large bodies of armed troops among us for protecting them by mock trial from punishment for any murders which they could commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving the benefits of trial by jury. So these are the charges for the prosecution. One of them was cut out. One of them was in the original. It was not in this one. This is, of course, the original, the fair copy. The guys say not in this copy, but in one of the handwritten copies by Jefferson. There's another section, which did not make it through editing. He has waged cruel war against human nature, and I can't read those words after human nature, and its most sacred rights of liberty in the persons of, okay.
I can do that for you.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, Thomas Jefferson. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred right of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where man should be bought and sold. He has
Prostituted.
he has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this
Execrable.
commerce, and that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished dye. He is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us, as to purchase the liberty of which he has deprived them, murdering the people upon whom he also obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another.
Okay, thank you, Pavlo. This did not make it through the editing process of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776. What this is a section which accuses the King of England, King George, of the slave trade. And when it says prostituted is negative, what he means there is he has vetoed all legislative attempts to end the slave trade by the colonies themselves. Some of the northern colonies, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New York, tried to end the slave trade that way. But Jefferson is playing fast and loose here because he's a Virginian. He owned slaves. And Virginia, who he became the governor of just a year later, did not try to end the slave trade. In fact, it profited greatly from the slave trade. He's quite correct when he says captivating, which means capturing in this case, carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere or incur miserable death in their transportation thither. That's the middle passage I mentioned a few moments ago. So he blames the Christian king of Great Britain when his own state profited greatly from the slave trade, when he profits greatly from the slave trade when he sells slaves. He talks about the horrors. Then he says that during the Revolutionary War, one of the things that the British did was arm free blacks and escaped slaves who fought for the British for their freedom. They ended up at the end of the war in southern Ontario or Nova Scotia. The blacks who were in the British Army. In fact, after the surrender at Yorktown, when the British were defeated, one of the things Washington demanded was the slaves be returned to their owners, and the British General Gates said no, that they were British subjects and they were free. And they were then settled in Nova Scotia and, as I said, what became Southern Ontario. But this is the other important. To purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them, and murdering people upon whom he's obtruded them. Obtruded means placed without their wanting, which is untrue. Thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. What Jefferson is getting at here is the idea of slave rebellion. And one of the things he wanted to put in the Declaration of Independence was this charge which would have whitewashed the slave policies of the American colonies. And here we see the great fear of slave rebellion, and we'll get to that. We'll continue to discuss this as we move along. In his only published book, Notes on the State of Virginia, this is what Jefferson, who had a decades-long relationship with Sally Hemings, said. Comparing them, that is to say blacks, by their faculties of memory, reason, and imagination, it appears to me that in memory they're equal to whites, in reason much inferior, as I think one could scarcely be found capable of tracing or comprehending the investigations of Euclid, and in imagination they are dull, tasteless, and anomalous. It would be unfair to follow them to Africa for this investigation. He also writes about how they stink. Their smell stinks. He also writes about the black poet Phyllis Wheatley, who was considered one of America's earliest poets and well-respected among American other poets of the period and the British establishment. He writes at one point that faith can produce a Wheatley, but she is not a poet. Her works are beneath the dignity of criticism. Euclid, interesting that he chooses that because he was friends with Benjamin Banneker, who was black, American scientist, lived most of his adult life in the UK, well, in Britain. I talked about slavery rebellion a few moments ago. You've often heard, I assume, of the Second Amendment, which is the amendment to the Constitution, part of the Bill of Rights, which protects the right to own arms. It says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. It's an interesting amendment, because at the time, the only militia, the key militias, and I thought I had a, I must not have done that slide. Oh, it's down here. The main militias were in the slave-holding South, and they're tasked with pursuing runaway slaves and suppressing the feared slave rebellion. So the point in the Constitution of having armed civilians was so they could be called out to pursue runaway slaves and kill them if they had to, or suppress a slave rebellion. This is, again, the background that Dubois comes out of. So in seeing his achievement as what he writes about and his own personal achievement, this is what you have to know about. So we get into the 1800s, things get really weird when it comes to racial thinking. We have Samuel Morton, who dies in 1851. He writes Crania Americana. This is an important book because in the 1830s, they had developed a strange part of racial thinking called polygenesis, meaning two acts of creation of humanity. Whites and maybe Asiatics, they were never quite sure, and blacks. And they actually referred to mulattoes as human mules. Now, what is a mule? Does anybody know what a mule is? What you get with how do you get a mule? Anybody know? M-U-L-E
Yep.
in English.
Yes. Interbreeding of, I think, mare and donkey.
Yes, yeah, it's a horse and donkey. You breed them. And the distinguishing feature of a mule is they cannot reproduce. So by calling a mulatto, a child of a white and a black, a human mule, the distinguishing feature scientifically of a mule is that it cannot reproduce. It's sterile. Mulattoes, as we saw before, are not. So, but this strange idea of polygenesis was a threat to evangelical Christianity, which I talked about in my last lecture, because it suggests the Bible is wrong, because there's only one act of creation of man in the Bible. So a lot of people said, wait a second, that can't be. So Morton, who's the early anthropologist, writes Crania Americana. And what he does is he gathers the brain, the craniums, the skulls of thousands of Americans, whites, blacks, Native Americans. and shows, surprise, surprise, that the cranium of a white person, that is to say, the brain size of a white person, is many times larger. Now, the interesting thing about his data is that it actually shows that the deviation between the smallest white brain and the largest white brain is many times greater than between the average white brain and the average quote-unquote black, these are all quotation marks, white brain, black brain, cranium. So that his own data shows that his conclusion makes no sense. In any case, we know that the size of the brain has nothing to do with intelligence. But let's put that, that wasn't determined until 100 years later. He was followed by a guy named Josiah Knott and George Glidden, who did more of this work, and they actually show, their work showed that if you look at this is the perfect image of the Caucasian, looks like a Greek statue, surprisingly enough. That's being ironic. Look at the structure of the face. This is of the so-called average African or African American and of a chimpanzee. Draw your own conclusions for what they were saying. Let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll turn our attention to Dubois. Okay?
Sounds great.
Okay, see you in 5 minutes.
Тоді, напевно, і зробимо паузу в записі, а потім продовжимо.
Okay, before I go into Dubois, I'm going to stop and just ask any questions on that background. I'm sure I could not have been that clear. I was a professor for 30 years. I know I'm not that good. So does anybody, any questions at all on that background? Okay, you're going to make me feel I am that good? Okay. All right, so W.E.B. Du Bois, we finally got to him. This is his first, most important, first book, The Philadelphia Negro, a social study, and its date 1899. So no, just before the turn of the century. He probably did the work on it, 2 years earlier and took a year to write. It's a very important book for a number of reasons. It's really the first book in the United States, the first sociological study of a community at the level that he studied it. There are works that write about New York. There's some stuff about the 5-point section of New York, which is gangs and crime-ridden. So that maybe that I should say would be the first, but this was among the first. And it's so it's path-breaking in that way, and of course it's pioneering because of who did it. Remember, America basically says this guy can't exist. This is what he found in the 7th Ward. The 7th Ward in the first slide. Okay. He lived in the poor 7th Ward, and it's the first statistical study and first phenomenological study, 5,000 door-to-door interviews. So in that sense, he's also pioneering. He combines a statistical breakdown with a phenomenological examination of life experience. So this, okay, so these are some of his conclusions. I can't go into the methodology for obvious time constraints. So as to getting work, so no matter how well a Negro may be trained, or how fitted for work of any kind, he cannot, in ordinary course of competition, hope to be much more than a menial servant. He cannot get clerical or supervisory work to do save in exceptional cases. He cannot teach save in a few remaining Negro schools. He cannot become a mechanic except for small transient jobs and cannot join a trade union. A Negro woman has but 3 careers open to her: domestic service, sewing, or married life. So these are what he's found in his interviews. As to keeping work, Pavlo, you'll have to read the first 3 because I can't get rid of the tile.
Sure. Okay, just a sec. As to keeping work, the Negro suffers in competition more severely than white men. Change in fashion is causing him to be replaced by whites in the better paid positions of domestic service. Whim and accident will cause him to lose a hard-earned place more quickly than the same thing would affect the white man.
Okay, I can read the rest. No, I can read the rest. Okay, well, let's just talk about those 3. So, okay, this is the key one. So, change in fashion here doesn't mean dress. It means rather that some of the areas where blacks could work, whites were taking over. Better positions of domestic service would be servers in a butlers, I guess, would be the more hiring English or French butlers had become de rigueur for the wealthy, so they no longer had black butlers. Women accident here means it's easier to dismiss him. The boss doesn't have to answer any questions. Being few in number compared with whites, the crime or carelessness of a few of his race is easily imputed to all, and the reputation of the good, industrious, and reliable suffer thereby. This is a key point. When you are a minority, let's say you're 11% of the population, and you have some bad apples, which you will, to use the American terminology, everyone says, you see this guy, he's black, he's a thief, he's a drunk, whatever, or she's a prostitute, and that is imputed to everybody else. It means it's assumed to be everybody else. I should have actually done something else above. I didn't, and that is the idea of lasciviousness. Racial thinking says something very important about black women, that they are that black men are sexual monsters wanting to rape. Notice I talked about Jefferson and rape, so we have here a certain amount of transference, and black women are highly sexualized. So if you see a black prostitute, then all prostitutes are black. That's what he's saying here. Of course, he's not saying it's true. He's saying that's what the experience of black people is in living as a minority in Philadelphia. Because Negro workmen may not often work side by side with white workmen, the individual black workman is rated not by his own efficiency, but by the efficiency of a whole group of black fellow workmen, which may often be low. Now, that's a very important point sociologically, because when you look at working efficiency, if you don't work next to a person of X background, then you will assume that every one of those X backgrounds are linked together in some sort of gestalt of how they work. That is to say, if that team of black workers is less efficient than a comparable team of white workers, then that's true for all black workers in the racial thinking, because you have no other experience. So that's where the phenomenological part of this comes in. So it's not just the phenomenology of being a black person in Philadelphia. It's also the other side of that, and I'm beginning to move my way to double consciousness. But the other side of that, how whites view blacks because of limited knowledge. Because of these difficulties, which virtually increase competition in his case, he, the black worker, is forced to take lower wages for the same work than a white workman. So what he's saying here is not that the black workers take lower wages necessarily because they are hungry and they'll work for anything to survive, although there is data to support that too. It's also because the social imaginary that has been created by the phenomenological experience forces him, that's to say the black worker, to accept lower wages. And it almost prevents the white employer from offering better wages. I say almost because you always have a choice. Pavlo, your turn.
Sure. Okay, Doc.
Men are used to.
Yes, men are used to see Negroes in inferior positions. When, therefore, by any chance a Negro gets a better position, most men immediately conclude that he is not fitted for it, even before he has a chance to show his fitness. If,
Okay,
therefore,
those of you who've been following the debate about diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI in the United States, and what the Trump administration and his acolytes refer to as DEI hires, that is to say you're hired because you're black or Hispanic or you're a woman in a man's job. This is exactly what Dubois is identifying as a key component of racial thinking in the United States. So even if you see a black man in a higher position, you are trained by the system not to assume he doesn't doesn't have legitimate claim to it. We saw 2 weeks ago with a helicopter, the tourist helicopter that went down in New York, killing a pilot and I think a family of 4. He was a Navy SEAL, the highest trained Navy position. As soon as that helicopter went down and it was known that he was a black man, the Trump administration started saying, you see, unfit to be a pilot. The helicopter went down because the back rotor broke off. Why that happened, we don't know. But it has nothing to do with the fact that the pilot was black. But that was the immediate jump. And I can point to any number of other examples of the Trump administration doing that, but you can see it's here too. If, therefore, he sets up a store, men will not patronize him. So if you won't go to a black store, because how can a black man have the skills to have a butcher shop, let's say? If he is put into a public position, people will complain. The Defense Department under the new Secretary of Defense, Pete Hesketh, has fired at least 6 or 7 senior black and female generals because they were black and female. If he gains a position in the commercial world, men will quietly secure his dismissal or see the white man succeeds him. I'll go to the second one because I can read it. He must pay more for houses than most white men. Actually, I can't read that one. Pavlo, can you read the first 2? Pavlo? Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was muted. As to his expenditure, the comparative smallness of the patronage of the Negro and the dislike of other customers make it usual to increase the charges or difficulties in certain direction in which a Negro must spend money. He must pay more house rent for worse houses than most white people pay. He is sometimes liable to insult or reluctant service in some restaurants, hotels and stores, at public resorts, theaters and places of recreation, and in nearly all barber shops.
So, I think these are relatively straightforward. I don't just, I think detail them. But what I want you to see is that what Dubois is doing here is he's building up a picture of what it's like to be black in the Ninth Ward in Philadelphia. In all its various sections: employment, restaurants, theaters, education, housing. So he does give the statistics, but he's also building up the life experience view. As to social intercourse, that means, he does not talking about sex here, it means relations. In all walks of life, the Negro is liable to meet some objection to the presence or some discourteous treatment, and ties of friendship or memory seldom are strong enough to hold across the color line. Key term here, the color line. If an invitation is issued to the public for any occasion, the Negro can never know whether he would be welcomed or not. If he goes, he's liable to have his feelings hurt and get into an unpleasant altercation. If he stays away, he's blamed for indifference. If he meets a lifelong white friend on the street, he is in a dilemma. If he does not greet the friend, he's put down as boorish or impolite. If he does greet the friend, he's liable to be flatly snubbed. So even your friend in a public position on the street may snub you if you're black. White friends call on him, but he scarcely, what's the word there?
Expected.
To call
Expected.
on them. Right, so white friends can come to his house, but he cannot go to theirs, save for strictly business matters. And if he does even that, what door does he have to enter the house through? The kitchen. Not allowed to come through the front door. If he gains the affections of a white woman and marries her, he may invariably expect that slurs will be thrown on her reputation and on his, and that both his and her race will shun their company. When he dies, he cannot be buried beside white corpses. Any questions so far on this? So, racism and black men. Black men, going back to slavery and slave revolt, were considered a threat to white women. That the black, what they call the black brute, you can see it here. The black brute was waiting to defile lily white virginity in the South. That's what black men lived for. And in the Jim Crow period, if you were walking on a street and you're black and a white woman is coming towards you, you had to step into the gutter, the road, and let her pass. If you didn't, you could be killed. You'd be lynched. And lynching was all but legal murder. We're going to get to lynching in a minute. This is what, in 1901, so this is a few years after the book we just looked at, a negrophobic writer named George Winston writes, "When a knock is heard at the door, a white woman shudders with nameless horror. The black brute is lurking in the dark, a monstrous beast crazed with lust. His ferocity is demoniacal. A mad bull or tiger could scarcely be more brutal. A whole community is frenzied with horror, with blind and furious rage for vengeance." There are any number of examples of this I could give you, including one of the first movies by W.E. Griffiths to be called Birth of a Nation, about the founding of the Ku Klux Klan, which premiered in the White House in 1913 and was praised by then President Woodrow Wilson, who was a Virginian. Rape was not a crime under slavery. Black women were chattel, property, no different than a horse. Black women and men, but we're talking about women in this case, no different than a horse or even a fence. So that's why black families could be broken up. You could just sell off the children, sell off the mother, sell off the father, which of course is the basis of the story, one of the key aspects of the story of Uncle Tom's Cabin. You know about, we discussed Thomas Jefferson, black women were considered lascivious, fear of slave revolt, specifically by former slaves taking revenge on white women. After Jim Crow, after slavery came Jim Crow, which is the anti-black laws in the American South, some of which are still on the books, and lynchings. Here are the number of lynchings of blacks between 1890 and 1902 per year. So in 1892, almost exact, there was one black person lynched every other day. Every third day. This is a lynching. You can see the body up there. And these are the people who came to watch it. This is, okay, I'm gonna have to, I've lost something I needed.
Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze. Strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees.
Okay, I lost. I can't see my own screen now, having done that.
We can see your slide.
Yeah, I can't. You can see my slide. How did I lose my slide? Okay, I'm going to stop the sharing for a second and set it up again. There it is. Okay. This is the song Strange Fruit by Albert Meapole, sung by Billie Holiday. And it talks about, it's a song about, it was written in the late 1930s. The last lynchings were in the 1950s. So strange fruit, southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves, blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. It's the kind of tree in the South. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth. Scent of magnolia, sweet, fresh, and all the sudden smell of burning flesh. Often the bodies were burned. So what I bring this up because I think it's important as we move to the other part of my discussion of Dubois, and that is the fact that he comes out of the tradition I sketched, the sociology I sketched of his youth in America, and then what he finds in Philadelphia, the phenomenological investigations. So he writes The Soul of Black Folk is his next important book. And he writes in it, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of man in Asia and Africa, in America, and the islands of the sea. At the beginning of The Soul of the Black Folk, and so this book is not a statistical study. It's rather a phenomenological investigation of what it is to be black. So the various chapters deal with different things, with black songs, with black faith. After the Egyptian and the Indian, the Greek and the Roman, and Pablo, I'm once again, oh wait a second, and Pablo, you better read the first part.
Yep. Okay, Souls of Black Folk 2. After the Egyptian and Indian, the Greek and Roman, the Teuton and the Mongolian, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in the American world.
Okay,
Well,
I'll take it from there. Great. Thank you very much. So seventh son, born with a veil, with second sight. This is where we're getting on to the idea of double consciousness. Seventh son is the son very far from inheritance. A world which yields him no true self. Now, I should have mentioned earlier also that Dubois can be quite Hegelian from his training in Europe. So we're in a Hegelian matrix here. A world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose, in this peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this scene of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape. Okay, that's American consciousness. Sorry, I split it up so it would be easy to read. Two warring ideals in dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. So what he's getting at here is that Black Americans, and this is true of all minorities, but he's writing about Black Americans. It's a very specific context because of the legal restrictions and historical things that occur in the United States. Is always measuring himself, not as an American, not as an individual, but rather as a Black person, or as he's using the word Negro of the time, as a Negro with this split idea. And it's always, part of it is amused contempt and pity, that you have internalized the contempt that the dominant society has for you, as well as in some cases pity. The sense of always looking through someone else, double consciousness, it's exhausting. Okay, Dubois' words can be misinterpreted. Measuring oneself in the tape of a world that looks on with amused contempt. What is he saying here? Who experiences the pity? Or in another way of asking this is, who is filled with pity? And here I want to speak of myself for a moment, because it's a little easier. As someone who's anchored in another group that has experienced double consciousness for uncounted generations. As most of you know, but if you didn't, you now do, I'm a Jew from New York. I do not come from a religious family, but I am Jewish. For thousands of years, my forefathers were in this Hegelian moment. And Du Bois was influenced by the master-slave dialectic. Okay, for those of you who don't remember your Hegel, it's a central idea, the master-slave or lordship and bondage. The master believes in himself. Think of it, a medieval knight. He requires recognition, but he requires recognition by the slave to prove his lordship over the slave. So how does a medieval knight who owns the castle, how does he know he's a medieval knight? Well, he doesn't think he's medieval, that's for sure. But it's because he's got all these people who recognize him as knight, as the great warrior. Nietzsche argues, of course, that this leads to the triumph of the slave morality of Christianity, but we can discuss that at another time. Now I'm only interested in the idea that those with power need the recognition of those without power to fully experience their power. So, my point in raising Hegel immediately after raising being a Jew is that those who were persecuted, murdered, and tried to extinguish by co-religionists required their presence of those they would extinguish to fully experience their own power. So this is, and I think probably just easier for me to refer as to Jews than talk about American blacks at the moment. But the dynamic is the same. It's what Du Bois is getting at. Jews, and therefore, and this can be extended to blacks, of course, had no choice but to see themselves through the eyes of the oppressor. At times, this meant acting the fool, as in Shakespeare. Most of the time, it was survival, not of the fittest, in the sense of physically strongest, but of he or she who could make himself more useful to the oppressor. So it's judging your fitness in the society, where you fit, not by your own abilities or the abilities of your people, if we want to put it that way, but rather by the views of the dominant society. And you internalize those. Now that brings me to double consciousness in Ukraine. The model I've sketched out here, I believe, is useful. A useful one for Ukrainians because, and I stress, I have not, and nor do I'm not Ukrainian, nor do I speak the language, nor do I have a degree in Eastern European, to say nothing of Ukrainian history or literature. Yet I've conducted at least 100 interviews with Ukrainians and have taught 2 graduate courses. So I think I can make a suggestion or two in terms of this model and how it's useful. It's not useful. It's useful not because Ukrainians or Ukraine are for especially what Putin say about the people or the nation. That's not the logic here. Rather, it's useful because Ukrainians have had to struggle with the imposition of a matrix, for lack of a better word, that rests on that the rest of the world, pushed by Russian propaganda, to say nothing of Trump, sees as the pecking order, or to me, what I mean by that is, the level of nations or nationhood. Ukrainians, from what I have learned from Pavlo, from my students, from the people I've interviewed in the 25 articles I've written, have had, I use the word struggle with this, not because it's the Ukrainians believe it at any level. It's rather because Ukrainians know the rest of the world does believe it, or at least many in power do believe it. Du Bois is useful because he shows in a different but surprisingly close context, albeit with his history, the structure of self-abnegation. His work is useful because he charts what Ukrainians know make a people. The last essay in the Souls of Black Folk is termed The Sorrow of Songs, and I will end with this one.
Performing on the biggest stage in the world was just one step in my journey.
Hi.
I thank you very much. And obviously, there's enough time for questions, and I'll be happy to take some. Oh, come on. Somebody has to have a question. Are you hearing me?
Yes,
Okay. No questions?
not at this point. A lot of food for thought, a lot of stuff to contemplate upon. But we'll be coming back.
Yes. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed the lecture.
We certainly did. Extremely enlightening, as always.
One last thing I think I'll say is that in Souls of Black Folk, one of the things that is unique about it at the time, and still not isn't done terribly often, is the focus on the spirituals, what we call Negro spirituals in the United States, and people's folk songs is another way of putting it. And of course, the singer was the great bass baritone Paul Robeson. And the song is a spiritual, and it's one of the places where one goes to, that's to say, a folk music. One can historically go to I don't want to say I want to say find the essence of a people, but that's much too deterministic. To find the sort of life view of a people, and it was again a path-breaking thing that Robeson did. Thank you very much.
Marvelous. Thank you. Been fantastic.
Well, thank you. No questions of anybody who's still here? Okay.